How's it going, everyone? Landan with Late Model Restoration. The great folks over at Vortech Superchargers were kind enough to hook us up with a non-intercooled V3 supercharger kit for our pristine 93 hatchback. Now, it's my job to give you guys a general understanding on how to install one of these kits into your 1986 to 1993 Mustang. Before I even unboxed our Vortech kit, I replaced all the spark plugs and regapped them to 35 thousandths of an inch to properly set them up for boost. I went with Motorcraft plugs for this application. I also performed a fresh oil change and went with the Motorcraft FL1A filter and Motorcraft oil. A new fuel filter wouldn't hurt either. Ours was recently replaced. Now, this car does have Dart Windsor Junior cylinder heads, which is a mild upgrade, along with a mild camshaft. Other than that, it features a high flow mid pipe, an Edelbrock Performer RPM intake manifold, and a 75mm throttle body. So with that out of our way, guys, it's time to turn the rollers and see what this car can make for some baseline numbers. Safety first. Alright guys, I just made 2 pulls on our Dyno Jet dyno to get some accurate baseline numbers. On the first pull, the car managed to make 253 horsepower and 288 pound-feet of torque. On the second pull, it managed to squeeze out 257 horsepower and 293 pound-feet of torque. Now, for it being an NA car and the mild-mannered mods it has, those are some pretty decent numbers. But now, it's time to install a Vortech Supercharger. To get things started on installing your non-intercooled Vortech kit, there are a few factory components you're either going to have to remove or reroute in preparation of this kit. Once you get those factory components removed or rerouted, I'm going to throw on the provided crank pulley from Vortech, along with their mounting bracket, mounting plate, tensioner, and its associated components. Then I'm going to dive into their provided fuel management unit, along with its accessories, and show you how to recalibrate it if your car has 24-pound injectors. Then I'm heading to the rear of the car and installing the T-Rex inline fuel pump to provide the needed fuel for this car to make max power. We are going to skip how to tap your oil pan because our Vortech V3 head unit is self-contained. Now, other than that, let's get started. In order to install this Vortech Supercharger kit in your Fox Mustang, above average automotive experience is highly recommended, as well as a wide variety of shop tools. After all, you are going to be working with high-end components that require close attention to detail in order for them to work as they should. Vortech does include a detailed installation manual, and I would recommend thoroughly going through it a few times to get yourself acclimated with the kit. Like any large install, I started off by disconnecting the negative battery cable. Remove the accessory drive belt and set it aside. Remove the 4 fan clutch to water pump pulley bolts. At the top of the radiator, remove the fan shroud retaining bolts and then lift the shroud and fan assembly out of the car. Now remove everything leading up to the throttle body, including the air filter assembly, mass airflow, and the resonator in the inner fender if yours is still in place. Remove the crankcase vent tube that is connected to the oil fill tube and the throttle body. Underneath the car, drain approximately 1 gallon of coolant from the radiator. This is done by loosening the drain plug. In our case, the plug was messed up, so I had to drain the coolant from the lower radiator hose. While you're under the car, disconnect the Smog pump electrical connection. Also, the evaporative canister needs to be slightly rotated in order to clear the provided bracket from Vortech. This is done by slightly rotating it at an angle. To do this, remove the frontmost retaining bolt and loosen the rearward bolt. Slightly angle the canister and then retighten the rearward bolt. Reinstall the front bolt back into the frame rail. Now you can remove the upper radiator hose, the alternator bracket, the smog pump, and the smog pump brace from the front of the engine. I would also take this time to disassemble the driver's side interior panels and trunk components so you can properly run the power wire from the T-Rex fuel pump relay to the fuse box. That completes the majority of the prep work. Now you can remove the factory crankshaft pulley from the harmonic balancer. Position the provided crank pulley from Vortech over the balancer and use the provided bolts and washers to secure it in place. Be sure and apply blue thread locking compound to the threads and then tighten the bolts in a crisscross pattern. Next up is the FMU, or Fuel Management Unit installation. Hold the unit against the inner fender, just in front of the passenger side shock tower and roughly an inch from the top. Mark the holes with a marker, center punch the marked holes, and then drill the holes with a bit that is a tad smaller than the provided sheet metal screws. Purge the fuel system of any pressure by depressing the Schrader valve. Use a spring lock disconnect tool to disconnect the fuel rail return line from the factory rubber hose located near the passenger side frame rail. This is the line that does not have the Schrader valve on it. Connect the FMU input hose to the return line coming from the fuel rail regulator. This hose will connect to the 90-degree fitting on the FMU. Now, connect the unit's return hose to the stock return hose. This hose connects to the center fitting on the FMU. Secure the fuel lines out of the way and make sure they're clear of the header. Use the provided vacuum hose and connect the manifold vacuum barb on the FMU to the vacuum tree near the brake booster. This hose is going to connect to the port designated B/R. I routed the hose over the top of the strut tower and down the back of the firewall and secured it with zip ties. Once the FMU is properly installed, you need to recalibrate it if your car has 24-pound injectors. To do this, simply loosen and remove the 6 Allen head bolts on the top of the FMU. Remove the top and then remove the diaphragm. Remove the disc from inside the FMU. Install the replacement ring with the notched part facing down over the small hole in the FMU. Now, place the new disc inside of the ring. Place the new diaphragm into place and then align the holes. Reinstall the FMU cover, apply a small amount of RTV to the threads, and then torque to 24 inch-pounds. Open the trunk or hatch and remove the spare tire. That's of course if you didn't do this in the beginning. Locate the provided T-Rex fuel pump template. Cut out the rectangle and then place it over the spare tire hold-down plate. Center punch the marked holes and then drill them out with a 3/16 drill bit. Support the fuel tank and then remove the 2 fuel tank strap bolts. Let the straps swing down and then loosen the fuel filler neck. Lower the tank and then disconnect and remove the factory rubber line running from the tank to the fuel filter. Remove the 90-degree fitting from the hose and set it aside. Attach one end of the supplied fuel line with the connections to the fuel tank pickup. Route the hose in the same direction as the factory hose. Go ahead and reinstall the fuel tank, filler neck, and the associated hardware. Make sure none of the hoses will be crushed by the tank. Mount the T-Rex fuel pump to the underside of the spare tire well with the provided rubber mounts and fasteners. Make sure that the flow arrow is pointing in the right direction. Connect the adapter fitting on the short hose from the T-Rex pump with the hose that you just installed on the fuel tank pickup. Slide one of the provided clamps over the longer hose on the T-Rex pump. Install the previously removed 90-degree fitting and then secure the hose clamp. Connect this hose to the fuel filter. Be sure and tie up all hoses out of the way of the rear end and of course the exhaust pipes. Back inside the spare tire well, mark and drill an 1/8 inch hole and mount the relay. It's going to mount towards the bottom right corner in the spare tire well. From relay number 85, tap the yellow wire into the factory fuel harness located near the passenger side taillight. Use the provided Scotch lock and tap into the red with purple striped wire. On some model years, this could be a brownish green wire. While you're still in the trunk, ground the short black wire from relay terminal number 86 to a clean ground. Route both of the red wires from terminal 30 and 87 along the edge of the spare tire well. Use some tape to hold them in place so you can come back later and wrap them with some convoluted tubing. Poke a small hole through the rubber grommet that is located right above one of the fuel tank strap mounts. Pass the red wire from terminal 87 into the grommet and route it to the T-Rex pump. Run the long red wire from terminal 30 up towards the interior panel and find the factory harness. Run this wire along the factory harness all the way to the fuse box. Be sure and secure it to the factory harness with either electrical tape or zip ties. Remove the kick panel and splice the wire with the provided inline fuse. Then, splice the inline fuse with the provided fuse tap. I tapped into the cigarette lighter fuse and of course install the tap onto the fused side. This can be tested with a voltmeter. Secure the wire and inline fuse out of the way and then reinstall your kick panel. Back at the fuel pump, splice the red wire from terminal 87 with the provided ring terminal. Secure this to the positive terminal on the T-Rex pump. Use the provided short black wire and install it onto the negative terminal on the T-Rex pump. Ground this underneath the car and make sure the ground is free of rust and paint. Check over everything and wrap any exposed wire in convoluted tubing and electrical tape. Go ahead and reconnect the negative battery cable and turn the key to the on position. Do not start the vehicle. Once you have verified the T-Rex fuel pump is active, take this time to reinstall your interior components. When assembling the mounting plate and bracket, you'll want to pay close attention to the instruction manual. Once you have everything installed and securely fastened, your assembly should look something like this. Now that the main bracket assembly is together, you can lower it into the engine bay and secure it into place. Because of the weight and size of the main bracket, I would recommend assistance from a friend when doing this. You can take this time to reconnect the Smog pump and alternator connections. When modifying the Smog pump hose assembly, separate the short hose and the bent hose from the air control valve. Now trim approximately 1.5 inches off of the longer, straight portion of the bent hose. Reverse the sides of the two hoses and then secure them with the previously removed clamps. Reposition the modified Smog pump hoses back into the car. On the factory radiator hose, make two 90-degree elbows by trimming the ends of the hose. The first elbow will be 3 inches by 3 inches and will be modified on the side that connects to the thermostat housing. The second elbow will be 2 inches by 2 inches and will be modified on the side that connects to the radiator. Position the two elbows over the provided stainless water pipe. The shorter section of the pipe will be closest to the radiator. Before reinstalling the factory belt tensioner, replace the locking nut on the AC mounting bracket stud closest to the water pump with a standard nut. Now, depending on Ford's manufacturing tolerances, it may be necessary to trim about 1/8 inch off the edge of the AC mounting bracket. In our case, I had to make that modification by using a body saw and of course a metal blade. Install the bracket and tensioner assembly and use the provided hardware to secure it into place. Alright guys, that's going to complete the majority of the install here for part 1. I did start out by removing and rerouting a few of the factory components. Once that was all said and done, I threw on the provided crank pulley from Vortech and then addressed the FMU, which included the recalibration since this car has the 24-pound injectors. After that, I went to the rear of the car, installed the inline T-Rex fuel pump underneath the spare tire well, and ran all of its fuel lines in the appropriate manner. Then I wired up its electrical system and even had to run a wire all the way to the front of the car so I could tap into the fuse box. After that, I addressed the mounting bracket, mounting plate, reinstalled the Smog pump and the alternator, and made a few modifications to the factory Smog pump hoses so they fit nice and tight here in the engine bay. Once that was all complete, I did modify the factory upper radiator hose to fit the provided Vortech piece. Now, ending stage 1, I did have to modify the AC bracket in order to clear the provided factory tensioner relocation bracket. Rolling into stage 2, I'm going to install the supercharger head unit, address the air inlet system, install the MSD ignition box, fill the supercharger up with oil, give the car a good final once over and make sure we're ready to roll, get the car on the dyno and see what it makes. Until I tackle stage 2 of our non-intercooled Vortech install, keep it right here with the Real Fox Enthusiasts, LMR.com. How's it going, everyone? Landan with Late Model Restoration. Our non-intercooled Vortech kit has now reached its second and final stage of the install into our pristine 93 silver hatchback. Now, for some reason you missed out on stage 1, no worries. Click the link in the video description to get that one underneath your belt and to see what I've already accomplished leading into stage 2. I am going to begin stage 2 by mounting the head unit to the mounting plate and making sure it's topped off with the provided oil from Vortech. Now this is their V3 head unit and it's internally lubricated, meaning I didn't have to drill and tap the oil pan. It's also satin black in color and it's going to look absolutely killer in the engine bay of our silver hatchback. After that, I'm going to throw on the tensioner and route the supercharger drive belt. Then it's over to the air inlet system, discharge tube, and bypass valve. Once that's all tidy, I'm going to mount and hide the MSD ignition box, as well as run the boost retard and all of its electrical wires in their proper orientation. Once that's all said and done, I'm going to give a solid once over the entire car to double check fittings, connections, hoses. Also going to double check timing and make sure the gas tank's topped off with 93 octane fuel. Then it's back on our DynoJet dyno to see how much power this thing's going to make. So without further ado, let's get started. Since this V3 head unit features self-contained oil, all I had to do was position it into the car and use the provided hardware to secure it into place. I did have to grind a little material off the Smog pump pivot boss in order to clear the supercharger. Of course, be sure and position the oil drain line out of the way. Install the supercharger belt idler assembly onto the supercharger using the provided hardware. Reinstall the water pump pulley and loosely tighten the hardware. Reroute the factory serpentine drive belt. Position the supercharger drive belt over the crank pulley. Provide tension to the assembly and then tighten it down. Place the plastic air filter cover against the inner fender just inside the passenger side headlight. Use the 2 holes as a template and then use a center punch to mark them. Remove the cover and drill those 2 holes with a 3/32 drill bit. Do not install the cover at this time. Insert the mass airflow meter into the filter cover. Place the provided air filter and clamp over the meter and then tighten the clamp. Install the assembly back into the inner fender and secure the cover with the provided sheet metal screws. The supplied MSD ignition and boost controller can be mounted wherever you like. Because the engine was already pretty full, I chose to mount it underneath the fender apron on the passenger side. The wheel and splash shield were removed to gain access. I used the provided hardware from MSD to mount the controller. I then ran the boost retard knob through the passenger side firewall grommet and plugged it into the controller. The knob was mounted on the driver's side, just to the right of the gas pedal and underneath the dash. I installed the provided vacuum tee fitting in line with the vacuum hose that was installed previously for the FMU. All of the wires were positioned so that they would pass along the front of the radiator and toward the ignition coil and battery. I did extend the wires and plug them into their intended location per the Vortech instruction manual. I then made sure all of the wires were wrapped in convoluted tubing. After that, the discharge tube and bypass valve assembly was installed along with the supercharger intake piping. I did have to install another T-fitting into the FMU vacuum line in order to connect the bypass valve. Cap the open port on the throttle body with the provided vacuum cap. Use the provided 3/8 rubber hose and inline filter to route the blow-by to the barb fitting on the air filter cover. Once all of the supercharger items have been installed, reinstall all of the factory components. Check the oil in the supercharger and refill the radiator with fresh coolant. Give everything a good solid once over to make sure everything is hooked up and installed correctly. Then you're all finished. All right guys, that's going to conclude part 2 and wrap up my install on the Vortech V3 supercharger into our pristine 93 hatchback. Now I begin part 2 by picking up from part 1, which I mounted the supercharger to the mounting plate with the provided hardware. I then installed its tensioner assembly and the drive belt. After that, I installed the air box, air filter, and the factory mass air meter. Then I took the wheel off, I removed the splash shield so I could properly mount and hide the included MSD ignition box. Now the reason why I chose this location is because the engine bay is already kind of full, and going with this spot to keep the box out of sight and out of mind. If you go this route, you will have to extend the wires going to the driver's side of the car to plug them into the coil and the positive and negative terminal on the battery. After that, I finished off the air inlet system, double checked my work over the entire car, and I backed the timing down to 10 degrees. Now, as far as the results and the dyno go, I'm gonna leave you guys leaning on the edge just a little bit longer. So to see those results, be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And for all things Fox Mustang, keep it right here with the real Fox enthusiast, LMR.com. How's it going, everyone? Landon with Late Model Restoration. Today is the day I bring you guys a video that is long overdue. Part 3 of the Vortech Supercharger install into our 93 hatch is finally here, and boy do I have some stuff to tell you guys. Let's get to it. First and foremost, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at parts 1 and 2, go ahead and get them out of your way. That way you can see what I've already accomplished thus far. I'm gonna shoot straight from the hip here, guys, and be totally honest with you on why the results took as long as they did. For one, we are the Fox Mustang enthusiasts, so when a problem arises, by golly, we're gonna fix it. That means we aren't going to pay said speed shop to do the work for us and then claim the fruits of their labor. In a nutshell, I'm working with a 93 Fox Mustang that is in immaculate shape. It does have low miles, but it is also a theft recovery car. When it was found, it was pieced back together with some decent parts, and it made great power. However, like most things, I took it for granted and expected everything to go a little bit smoother than it actually did. Upon completion of the Vortech Supercharger, I strapped the car to our dyno and made a pull. After seeing the results, I knew something wasn't quite right. I attempted another pull and achieved the same disappointing results. The car was making less power with the Vortech Supercharger than it was in naturally aspirated trim. After staring aimlessly into space and going back and forth with a few employees, it was time to hook up a boost gauge and a fuel pressure gauge to get some baseline readings. Well, lo and behold, fuel pressure was dropping to as low as 20 PSI when the car got into boost, and on top of that, it was only making 6 pounds of boost. Now, dealing with a 24-year-old car and it being a theft recovery, where do I even start? The car itself needed an engine bay refresh, so I swapped the Edelbrock Performer intake for that of a 93 Cobra intake, well, simply because the 93 Cobra intake looks better. The FMU and 24-pound injectors were removed, and in its place went 42-pound injectors with a properly calibrated mass airflow meter from Pro-M. Back on the dyno it went with hopes of a decent number. The very first pull, fuel pressure immediately dropped, so I aborted the run. From here, fuel pressure was obviously our issue. I checked over the hard lines just to make sure they weren't crushed, and I even replaced the 2 rubber hoses near the frame rail. I dropped the tank to inspect the fuel pump and the wiring. The S hose did have a small tear in it, so I replaced it along with the fuel pump in hopes that that was the issue. After reinstalling the tank and starting the car, fuel pressure was still the issue. At this point, I was about to throw an entire fuel system at this thing because I knew you guys would appreciate a detailed how-to video on installing a full fuel system into a Fox Mustang. Well, with more and more troubleshooting, it came down to ditching the T-Rex pump and dropping the tank again to outfit the car with an Aeromotive 340 liter per hour fuel pump. Here's when it gets pretty crazy, guys. Upon removal of the fuel pump bracket and S-hose, a small glimmer of blue exposed itself from the supply line. After all of this back and forth nonsense, there ended up being a damn butt connector in the supply line of the fuel pump bracket. Now, don't ask me how that got there, but more than likely it did get there from the previous owner, and the S-hose that they put on the car probably had a butt connector wiggle its way in, since those components do come in an installation kit that are all inside of a little baggie. Guys, I can't make this up. That butt connector in that fuel pump bracket supply line, it's real freaking life. Once all that was sorted and the tank was reinstalled, I fired the car up, gave it a few revs, and finally the fuel pressure issue was solved. Little did I know there was going to be a butt connector in the supply line of the fuel pump bracket, so in all reality, the FMU and the T-Rex, they could have stayed. Also, while I had the car in the air addressing the Aeromotive 340 pump, I installed an SVE off-road H-pipe and a Flowmaster American Thunder catback with the correct tips for an LX. Now, after all the waiting and agony on my end, getting this thorn in my ass car figured out, let's strap it to the rollers and see what this thing can do. Hot damn, how does 375 horsepower and 403 pound-feet of torque sound? From our baseline run of 257 horsepower and 293 pound-feet of torque, this Vortech Supercharger kit was good for peak gains of 118 horsepower and 110 pound-feet of torque. It's also going to provide well over 100 horsepower and torque throughout the curve. Guys, I'm sorry it took this long, but from trying to troubleshoot this car and our day-to-day video schedule to keep content rolling out to you guys, it was tough to balance both. I hope you all have enjoyed my detailed installation process on this Vortech V3 Supercharger kit as much as I have enjoyed showing you. Now, if there is anything to take away from this, never, and I mean never, take Fox Mustangs for granted. Until next time, guys, you can count on us, the real, the only Fox Mustang enthusiasts, LMR.com.